Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next panel, Time's Up, How to Create Non-Complicit and Zero-Tolerance Culture, with Mary Haviland, Executive Director, NYC Alliance Against Sexual Assault, Kristen Gibbons-Fedden, Attorney, Stradley Ronan Stevens and Young, Allison Yarrow, Journalist, Author, 90s Bitch Media, Culture and Failed Promise of Gender Equality, and moderated by Susan McPherson, founder and CEO, McPherson Strategies.
Good morning, everyone. I'm taking this seat since Reshma was sitting here, and I want some of her good juju to flow on me. Are you all excited? It's a Friday, it's a beautiful sunny day, and you're at the best conference of the year, and I'm certainly happy to be here. I'm Susan McPherson, and I'm going to be moderating this panel that's going to dive in a bit more deeply on the state of Time's Up, but what all of us can be doing, both in the workplace and in our communities, to really get to a place of zero tolerance. I don't know about you, but we sometimes hear, you'd have to be under a rock to have not seen the reverberations for the last year since this was first, spawned. But I would go so far as you'd have to be 20 meters underground to not have seen what we have seen. So before we start diving in, I would love for each of our panelists to introduce herself and give you a bit of brief background on what each does, because they are extraordinarily accomplished in their various professions. So I'm going to lead off with Allison Yarrow.
I'm Allison Yarrow. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you, Susan. I'm a journalist covering gender and politics and health. I've been doing this work for about 13 years. And I'm the author of 90s Bitch, Media, Culture, and the Failed Promise of Gender Equality, which is a book about how narratives of famous and infamous women during the 90s pretty universally and systematically painted them as bitches. And so I sort of dig into those narratives, I speak to those women, and I look at how those stories shaped the millennial generation and girlhood in the 90s.
Can I just say it again, 90s Bitch? It's just such a great title. And you obviously can buy the book. I'm not her book publicist, but you can buy the book on Amazon and numerous other places.
I think in the lobby, actually, as well.
All right, look at me. Okay, I'm trying to be millennial. Kristen.
Hi, my name is Kristen Fedden. I am an associate at Stradley Ronan Stevens and Young. We are a regional law firm. Part of my concentration and practice involves doing internal investigations regarding discrimination complaints as well as sexual harassment complaints on corporate, governmental, as well as educational institutions. They would also call me in to review the policies and procedures to make sure that they're up to par and in compliance with the law. Formerly, I was a prosecutor in the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office, where I served as a captain of elder abuse, as well as the captain of domestic violence, as well as a member of the sex crimes team. And so I prosecuted not only homicides, but also sexually violent crimes against children, as well as adults, with my most notable case being the Commonwealth versus William H. Cosby.
Okay, can you shorten his name a bit?
Applause.
AKA Bill Cosby, okay? Thank you. Mary.
So my name is Mary Haviland. I'm the Executive Director of the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault. The Alliance is a almost 20-year organization that's an umbrella organization for rape crisis centers in New York City. We concentrate on two things. We concentrate on improving the response, the immediate response to crisis and violation of sexual assault. And the second thing we concentrate on is prevention. We are the largest training institute for forensic examiners in the state of New York, and we also provide technical assistance to hospitals about how to provide best care. One of the things I'm most proud about is that we have been doing prevention for the last 10 years, and people ask, what is sexual assault prevention exactly? Well, one of the things that we're doing is we're working with youth in diverse communities, youth from the age of 13 to 18. We have an 18-week group that culminates in the youth designing their own social media campaign and doing their own community mobilization activities. We've done groups in the Black community, the Latinx community, the South Asian community, the East Asian community, and we're now running a group for young men of color and for the LGBT community. So I'm very proud of our efforts to improve the response to sexual assault in New York City.
And can I just see a show of hands? How many of you are local, meaning live in the 5 boroughs? Okay, so this is something you should be sharing with your families and children, and neighbors and schools and offices. Okay, so let's kick things off. As mentioned, it's been a year. What has changed? What is still the same? Would you like to take?
Sure. One of the things I think has not changed, I'll begin with that and then kind of end with an inspiring
And then Allison
portion.
can dive in.
One thing that has not changed, I have found, is that there is still a huge prevalence of misconceptions about people who have been sexually violated. You still see, unfortunately, on the media where women and men alike, survivors, are blamed for the actions that they took after being sexually violated, which is completely re-traumatizing for that individual. So I think that though we've made a lot of progress, we still have a fight ahead of us. But to end on an inspiring note, one thing that I think is really key is that we are getting the ears of leaders within the world. Politicians, CEOs of large companies, we're getting their ears, and some of the progress that has been made are different legislative changes, and I know we're going to get to that in a few. But one legislative change that I think is really important is rape kit backlogs. When a woman is sexually violated, if they report it right away, or a man is sexually violated and they report it right away, there is some forensic evidence that can be collected to help with the prosecution of that individual. And that is really key, because if that person goes to the hospital, they undergo, and the only reason I kind of want to get into this a little bit is they undergo something very invasive. After being raped or sexually violated, now they have to go to a hospital where they are getting cotton swabs of their different private areas. And so that can be really re-traumatizing for a survivor who has now come forward. And yet and still, we have tons of rape kits that are being untested. And so basically those results are sitting in a box, untested. And so there's been different legislative changes, and I think that's the most significant one, because I'm sure we'll all add some. That's one of the most significant changes that I think needs to be followed through in every single state.
Allison, what about from a cultural perspective?
Sure. I mean, as a media critic, I want to look at sort of how are we telling these stories. I mean, just so a quick show of hands, how many of you said Me Too in the last year? Okay, so that's a lot of us, right? So many of us are beginning to sort of see that others are sharing stories. We've experienced sexual misconduct or assault or harassment. We've felt the ways in which women have been sort of subverted because of our gender. And so I think it's really important for us to sort of see other women share these stories. But also, I think, we were discussing this earlier, just the idea that there have been so few consequences for the high-profile men who have been charged with sexual harassment, with assault, with misconduct. Bill Cosby, thanks to you and others, is someone who has faced consequences, is someone who is going to jail. But there are other men who sort of have had really no consequences whatsoever, and many of the high-profile cases are members of the media. So I think that we can begin to talk about sort of these egregious examples of harassment, assault, and abuse, like I guess the prototypical one is Harvey Weinstein. But also there's a lot of gray area sexism that we're really just sort of beginning to try to navigate and understand the ways in which maybe a woman is sort of not mentored as much as a man, or passed over for a promotion, or sort of forced out of the workforce after pregnancy or childbirth. These are also areas that we really need to be digging into, and storytelling is important there.
Yes. Mary, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'd like to just piggyback on something that Allison said. I think that the Me Too movement, and I'm proud to say that Tarana Burke was our keynote speaker last May, so I've met her in person. She's an incredible activist and advocate in this field, and she was brilliant in the sense of bringing people's narratives into the conversation. And I honestly, as somebody who has been doing this work for almost 40 years, domestic violence first and then sexual assault, we are digging deeper into the issue than we ever have before. We're looking at questions like, when does power become coercion? When does aggression become coercion? What's behind the notion that women, in order to have sex, have to be pushed to have sex? Some of these kinds of very deep myths that have been following us for years and years, I think we are really starting to dig into, thanks to Tarana Burke and the Me Too movement.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. So we're talking today, and specifically in this panel, about how do we, in the workplace, in our communities, get to zero tolerance. And I'll start with you, Kristen.
Sure.
Because I don't want to think of it as a long road ahead.
No, I think the way that entities, corporate entities, educational entities, governmental entities get to a zero tolerance workforce, I think one of the major ways is to have the support from the leaders in the firm. Once you have support from the leaders of the firm, then you can then change the culture. Because you can have all the policies and procedures in place, but if there is a culture within that organization where people get sexually harassed and it's a wink and a pass, then it's never going to change. I think that if you have leadership support, then you can then change your policies and procedures. You can make sure that there is a clear-cut reporting mechanism in place for people who feel sexually harassed or, God forbid, they get sexually assaulted in the workplace. Because unfortunately, it does happen. Not only a clear reporting system, but I think it's also important to have accountability as well as confidentiality for the reporter. Because if the reporter, obviously there are laws in place that prevent retaliation, but you need to have some type of language or culture in place that it is clear to the reporter that if they do disclose that they have been sexually harassed, they will be protected against retaliation from the top. And it's got to be a top-down approach.
Yes, well, we all know what starts here ends up down here.
Right.
Allison.
I think that sexual harassment in the workplace has a very long history of existence in this country and elsewhere. I mean, I write about in the book sort of how at the turn of the century there were glassworking factories where women would be harassed, they would sort of be raped and would be forced out of their jobs. And one factory in particular said, we're just going to change, we're going to take all the older women and replace them, or all the younger women and replace them with older women in hopes that this harassment and rape will abate, which is just such a ridiculous solution. But then, we think about 1991, right? Anita Hill coming forward and saying that she had been sexually harassed by someone who was appointed to the Supreme Court. And I don't think we really, truly, even today, appreciate the extent to which that behavior, it wasn't about sex, but even at the time, it was sort of painted in a sexual light. Yeah. It was really about the derailing of her career. I mean, this was someone who was working for someone who would go on to work on the Supreme Court. And imagine sort of what that could have meant for her life and for her career, but instead she fled the harassment. Yeah. She went to work at a law school in Oklahoma where their accreditation was hanging by a string. And she really had to sort of leave the pulse and power of Washington where she had sort of earned, and people then asked, why did you keep in touch with him? Why did you continue that relationship? And I'm sure you both can speak to this too. Often when women are sexually harassed, it's by someone, it might be by the most powerful person that they know.
It's about power.
Because it's about power and not sex.
No. Mary, do you want to address safe spaces here as well, or you were about to say something?
I was going to say that I agree with Kristen around the leadership.
Yes.
That the leadership has to be there, and when you look at the percentage of women on boards of corporations, it's 13% nationwide. Yep. When you look at the percentage of people of color on boards, it's also 13%, 10% men, 3% women of color. We have to change those power dynamics at the top, but also I completely agree that there have to be policies in place, and the policies have to be followed, because if they're not followed, everybody knows that they're not followed. The thing about retaliation and coming forward is we know that many women experience sexual harassment on the job, but only about 30% of those women actually report it. So there are forces that are keeping women and men when they're subject to sexual assault or sexual harassment from coming forward, and those obstacles have to be reduced.
Sure, sure. Thank you for that. Specifically in the workplace, and all of us can weigh in. Reshma, who was on the previous panel, talked about, the younger generations, millennials, are going to be much more, and probably Gen Z, are going to be much more vocal than perhaps people of my generation, like back when the dinosaurs were sprouting. However, that is kind of a generalization. Are there specific things besides obviously systemic changes that need to happen? And what can individual employees be doing, as opposed to being bystanders that don't report? Okay.
So in addition to having clear-cut policies and procedures in place and making sure that the reporter is safe, there can also be periodic assessments that employers can engage to make sure on an anonymous level that all people or all of the employees feel safe and feel not harassed within the workplace, and if they do, to outline what it is, what type of behavior it is that they feel sexually harassed about, and what individuals are the people who are doing it. Just outlining the culture and making it known. The other thing I think that would be important, in addition to periodic assessments, would also be to make sure that not only is there a review process, and this would be an independent person. So in other words, the employer would go outside and hire an independent company, whether it be a law firm or some type of human relations type firm, to make sure that there are policies and procedures in place, and also to run those periodic assessments. But again, I think that policies and procedures need to be reviewed on quite a frequent basis. But I also think mandatory trainings of sexual harassment, what behaviors would constitute sexual harassment, or also mandatory trainings on what to do if someone reports sexual harassment to you, but yet you're not the top person who should be the receiver of that complaint. Individuals may feel comfortable going to a certain person. Well, then maybe that person needs to step up and report it to the appropriate entity. So there's a number of things that employers could do to make sure that sexual harassment is being reduced or at least eliminated.
Yeah, and reporting is obviously one of the key. You have to make people feel comfortable. I mean, I keep hearing the subway man or subway say, if you see it, say it, right? How many of you have heard that on the subway, right?
Oh, yeah.
Even in Philadelphia, you can
That's
hear.
right.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
So I wanted to weigh in on the prevention aspect,
Yes.
because there is quite a concerted effort to think about sexual assault prevention, to research the things that work to prevent sexual assault. And one of the first places is the place we've already talked about, and that is changing norms and changing people's ideas and even setting up the goal of zero tolerance, right? Yeah. But the other thing is to make people understand the harm that sexual assault causes, and I think Me Too has played a big role in doing that. I think there's more understanding. I think there was a lot of I know that people in my circle said, I can't believe that Dr. Ford, after 30 years, that it's had such profound effects on her life. And having done domestic violence for a very long time and then switched to sexual assault, it was one of the first things that I really noticed about survivors when I saw them in a private, confidential setting. What a profound impact that violation has on somebody. It's an intimate, profound violation that really has an impact that ripples through your life. So I think understanding that and setting up a workplace where there's some understanding of that, but also I think people have to be open to disclosures from coworkers, from people they're working with, and the way to do that is to believe, is to not question, is to let survivors make their own choices. They may choose not to report for very good reasons, to try to support those with safety. So I think, and there are kind of tips on the, on the internet about how to do that, how to support a survivor, but I think it's very important that each person take on that openness, and we call that in the prevention world bystander intervention. I think people have been hearing about that, but we are training people to feel comfortable to step up, to feel adequate in stepping up. We're working in nightlife spaces, for example, in bars, teaching bar staff and bar managers how to step up when they see that somebody looks vulnerable. So it's those kinds of measures, I think, that bring about social change.
Sure.
How can we be bystanders? How can just sort of normal people in the world be bystanders?
Well,
Good
so I'll use an example from my life. One day I was on the train, the subway, and I saw somebody sit down next to a woman, and he started talking to her, and I could tell that she felt very uncomfortable. And he kept on talking to her and would not leave her alone. So I just went up to her and pretended I knew her. And I said, "Hi, how are you? Do you remember me? My name's Mary. I can't remember where we met." And I brainstormed. I do sexual assault work. I made up something. I think I said, "I'm a lawyer. I live in New York City. Where could we have met?" And he immediately stopped. He immediately stopped. Sometimes it takes just a simple action like offering a potato chip or offering something that you're eating to interrupt the dynamic. And that person, the harm doer, immediately feels self-conscious and realizes that he's overstepping or she's overstepping boundaries.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's interesting. Many of us work now in shared office spaces. Companies are made up now of disparate offices, and so from just the norms are all changing, right? Instead of us all going to the same workplace. And I would love to ask Allison if you have ideas on when everybody's working together and they don't work for the same company. How do you implement such things?
Yeah, it's a tricky question that we're all kind of wrestling with now. But I think, it all goes back to sort of what is acceptable behavior between men, women, all genders. How should we be treating each other? Yeah. And I don't think it matters if, you and I are working for different companies. I think there should still be kind
respect,
of
trust.
Right, just sort of respect and trust and recognition when you're making someone uncomfortable. I think that's been a major sort of flashpoint in Me Too, and sort of the way it's been, the storytelling around it, the way that it's been covered is sort of a lot of men recognizing that I've been participating in behaviors that have been making women I work with uncomfortable, and I didn't even realize it. But now that I'm sort of, it's being revealed, it's sort of out in the open, and maybe now I need to change my behavior. I've been having so many interesting conversations with just men in my life and men in sort of professional environments around these topics, and to me, that is something that we really can't underestimate the importance of that in the last year, just that recognition from men.
Good. Well, it's about time. That's going to be the next hashtag. Anybody else want to weigh in? I mean, from a legal perspective, how does that work in these kind of shared office spaces?
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what you said. I think in those type of office spaces, obviously the sexual harassment policies and procedures would only go directly down, right? And so it would be based on what the employer states. But there are certain laws in place that would prohibit certain conduct if it was criminal. There are also civil laws in place that would, if you tell someone to stop, yet they're being pervasive and they're causing you some type of mental distress, there are different civil remedies in place that person could explore as well.
Sure.
Could I put a plug in for New York State and New York City?
Considering 80% of the audience lives here.
So New York State just passed a sexual harassment bill that's very comprehensive, actually, that requires training, like you're talking about. Requires training for all employers, no matter how big or small you are, there is no minimum requirement. So everybody in New York State is going to be implementing a training program. They also outlawed confidential agreements unless the survivor wants that agreement. They're going to be creating model trainings. They are requiring reporting. And the New York City Council also just passed a big piece of legislation in May that does a similar thing. Everybody in New York City, all employers with 15 or more employees will have to institute a training. It has to be interactive. It has to contain bystander elements. So there are legal sort of advances that are being made around this. Can I say one more thing about the new way of working? I want to put in a plug for employers thinking about their physical plant and how safe it is. I want them to think about things like if their employees work late hours, are they providing transportation?
Yes.
Are they getting people home safely? I mean, these are things that are sort of called harm reduction and can end up blaming the victim a little bit. So we have to be careful of them. But if the workplace is active at looking at some of these things, you can, and elicits the opinion of the employees to look at some of these things, you can engage the whole employee pool in making the place safer, and it starts to change the culture.
No, that's so true, because I can't tell you how many times, years ago, leaving the office and thinking, should I take a taxi? I mean, we didn't have Lyft or Uber then, or the subway. And you could imagine the next day if something had happened, you'd blame yourself that you took the subway or you walked home rather than. So I think that take the onus off the individual in as many cases as you can.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think I would have, leaving work as sort of a younger person, I wouldn't have even thought about my employer playing a role in whether something happened.
Right, but could you imagine yourself the next day? Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, but these are things, thank you, Mary, because these are things we should be, now that we know, right? I mean, no one, again, unless you were 30 meters under, we know this is prevalent and pervasive. So last week, or 2 weeks ago, the Kavanaugh hearings, right? I mean, that just, I think all of us, again, took a deep, hard breath of, oh my gosh, here we are again, 30 years after Anita Hill. Can you explain, how that, just from a cultural perspective, might have felt for people, certainly who have experienced?
I mean, I think it was certainly it was re-traumatizing for victims the way that when Anita Hill came forward and she spoke of the harassment she experienced, many women said, me too, and kind of felt that deeply. I think many people, when they saw Dr. Ford with just the bravery and the poise, I mean, she was such a fantastic witness, right? I mean, she did everything right. But I think one of the questions that a lot of women ask is, must you be such a perfect witness to sort of credibly claim that you've been the victim of sexual harassment or sexual assault? I mean, what if she had had a lot to drink? What if she had, decided that she sort of wanted to participate in a relationship with someone and then kind of pulled back her, what if she wasn't the perfect witness that she was? Then what?
And white. And
well
dressed, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that plus, talking to people afterwards, people said, Dr. Blasey Ford is so credible and believable, but then they said, well, also, Brett Kavanaugh was so credible and believable. I heard that from men sort of later in the day. And I thought, how can those two things both be true? Clearly, we have some work left to do.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to know that these misconceptions are still alive today. We have made such progress. In the prosecutor's office, I have tried rape cases, and it's really prevalent when you have adult rape cases where the victim is an adult, to see the trend and the progression. And I think it is powerful and amazing. But we have so much work to do, and I think it's really important that we stay steadfast and continue our work. To kind of just add on to what you said, yeah, I agree 100%. But there has to be more of an education with it. Yeah. Even though the thing is, there is no perfect person, and so there will never be a perfect victim or perfect survivor. People, if there was something that would immunize us from sexual violence, I think all of us would put on that cloak, right?
Or the vaccination.
Right. Get that vaccination, right? Afraid of needles or not. And
all right, we'll sniff it.
Right, and it's just so crazy to think that creates the misconceptions that say, oh, well, she may have deserved it. Oh, she's incredible. She is not to be believed because of X, Y, Z, what she wore, the fact that she had contact with him afterwards, despite the fact that he was her employer. I mean, Anita Hill, for example, and I know I'm kind of digressing, so I'll stop in a second. Anita Hill's employer Clarence Thomas was the head of the EEOC,
I
the
know.
Equal Opportunity Commission. That's where people go when they get discriminated.
Yep.
They
Or
hear
sexually
claims of sexual
harassed,
harassment, right.
And so it's those dynamics and those education and that awareness that people need to fully take in and not just see on a superficial level, so that I think will allow them to fully understand that these misconceptions have got to end, and that victims and survivors, and I think this is key with the Me Too movement, need to at least come in at a level playing field.
Yes.
You don't hear the accused getting attacked on what he wore, why he was there, what he was drinking, this and that. Neither should the survivor. Neither should that victim. And that's where we need to be on an equal playing field. Sorry, that's
She's a little passionate about this, right? But we all are, I think, and we just have different ways of sharing that. Thank you. Mary, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think the moments that was the hardest for, first of all, I want to call out to all the survivors who had to sit through that whole experience, because it was really, really rough to watch not just her testimony, but to watch sort of the reaction of the committee, which was, yes, maybe this happened, but it's not important enough for us to prevent this from going through, was basically the bottom line. The other cry or sort of outcry about this was he was guilty before, he was not innocent, or he was proven guilty before the evidence was put forth. How many people of color can say that in this country, that they were guilty before they were proven innocent? And how many black men have been accused of rape falsely in this country, and even lynched in this country as a result?
Or accused of
rape?
murder or robbery.
Right. Not only that, but if Judge Kavanaugh had talked to himself in his courtroom as somebody trying to assert their innocence, Judge Kavanaugh himself, sitting in the judge position, would have kicked out Judge Kavanaugh for the way he spoke. And so, our short-sighted, non-historical look at this, and maybe my age is coming out too, Susan, is extremely disturbing.
And can we just say age is a virtue?
Leads to wisdom, right?
It does. Oh my God, if I knew now what I knew then, I'd be no, I wouldn't be president, but I would be something, oh, never mind. I'm digressing. I did want to I had to bring up, just given the news of this week, because every week something crazy happens, when you mentioned that, Clarence Thomas running the EEOC, well, now we're suggesting that the Saudi government try and do the research to determine whether and who killed Khashoggi. So now I'm really digressing, so we'll get back. So we've had a great discussion for the last 30 some odd minutes. Why should we, and all of us in this room, feel optimistic looking forward? Allison?
Well, I think a huge victory is seeing it, right? For so long, it was so buried, sort of the ways in which the 90s, Anita Hill, inspired the current moment. We didn't see it. We're beginning to sort of have a reckoning with the sexism, the abuse, the misconduct of the past.
Yeah.
And for it to remain buried, for us to not see it, that's hugely problematic. That we see it inspires me. Many of us are beginning to discuss the internalized sexism that we sort of grew up with.
Yeah.
And so I think that we can't do anything until we identify what the problem is. And we really are beginning to, I think in many ways, identify the real problem.
Yeah, and awareness.
And we see that also these individual behaviors are not the product of individuals. They uphold patriarchy and white supremacy. And so I think as we see, abuse, harassment, rape, all of these crimes and all of these behaviors, when we see them as part of a larger structural system that keeps women in place, then we're really inspired to make change.
Sure. And we haven't even, during this panel, we haven't even begun to even deal with the challenge of just the new world of gender, too, which is going to be next year's topic. So.
I think there's a lot to be inspired by. But if I had to pick just one, just for sake of time, I think that we need to also look for inspiration in things that didn't quite result in the way that we wanted it to, and to look for ways to make it better. I think when you look at Anita Hill and Dr. Ford, you look at the Senate Judiciary Committee. I believe it was all white men.
It was.
Okay? Now you look at the Senate Judiciary Committee, and look, I understand we did not get the result we wanted, right? But you have women of color. You have men of color. You have women and men. It's not all just white men. And so I have to say that the elected officials, is more reason why we need to get out there, we need to vote, we need to talk to our legislators, our congressional people, our state representatives, our congressmen, tell them what our ideas are, and if they don't follow through, you don't vote for them. You get out there, you make sure that your voice is heard. They work for us, and so we need to push it all the way to the top.
All right, and if I can add, oh, yes, of course. Yes. Our employers don't work for us, we work for them, but I think there needs to be this notion of carrying your voice and opening your voice up at your workplace too, because they need you as much as you need them. And Mary?
Well, I do have a little bit of a long view, having started this work in the late 70s, and I can tell you things were much worse then. I can absolutely attest that they were much worse. I would go to talk to audiences about domestic violence, and almost everybody in the audience thought that if the female companion did X, she deserved to be beaten. It was burn dinner, it was have an affair, it was look at another man, it was almost 80%, probably 80% of the audiences would think that beating was deserved. We have come a long way in our laws, in our attitudes, and I agree with Allison that we are digging deeper and talking about these things in ways that we haven't talked about them before. Sure. But I also 100% agree with Kristen about we have to get out and we have to be active in our communities, and we have to speak up when we see something that we disagree with. We have to help friends, and we have to vote.
Yeah, and for those of you who have children, give them the safe space to come to you if they either are a victim or they see something, and know where you should go and report that. Mary, what you were just saying about how far we've come, a few years ago, it was probably 5 years ago at this point, I remember pitching one of the major morning news programs about a major new domestic violence initiative, or to end. And the comment back from a producer was, we don't want to talk about domestic violence on the not to be named news program because nobody wants to hear about it. And the fact that domestic violence and certainly sexual violence affects 1 in 4, 1 in 5 women in their lifetime, I thought to myself, if the morning programs are not talking about this, what? So to me, just in the 5 to 6 years since then, I feel optimistic that this is now on every breakfast table, people are talking about it. Okay, well, we're about out of time. Is there anything other than vote, anything else you want to leave this wonderful audience with?
I would just like to say, in addition to voting, I think it's also important that if a survivor does come to you and feels comfortable enough to disclose, I think it's really important that in all of your responses, in your questions, your inquiries, you stay steadfast, you look at them with a judgment-free lens, and you allow them to just be themselves and offer any support.
And give them a hug.
Yeah, give them a hug.
I mean, there's nothing better than that. Allison, any final?
I love
Mary?
that. I know.
And carry potato chips with you on the subway.
And chocolate.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, that's a given. I want to thank the audience for coming along with us today. And I want to thank Claudia Chan for putting together this fabulous, fabulous event. And most especially, I want to thank Allison, Kristen, and Mary for your contributions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.